there's a negative assumption about capitalism in the function of it turning into fascism, which is actively happening inside the United States, which is a function of the Confederacy not being restrained. The United States, in its Civil War, would have, by definition, if it had done it correctly, removed the Confederates from all power and had punished them correctly for their insurrection. If that had happened, the breakdown into the wizards' functions of the KKK and secret societies and functions of undermining the arrangements wouldn't have happened. The government being able to block the information essential to the preservation of capitalism wouldn't have happened. And thus, the engagement to these developments is not the position stated by some that capitalism will always degrade into fascism or it will always eat itself. The function is the active needing for law and order to exist for it to be stable. It is a non-violent contest, and the existence of the violence intermingling with it is a failure of law enforcement, and thus the arrangement of the capacity to keep the secrets of the government using communism or the centrally planned agreement, which is the function of the company owning everything, which is the function of the government becoming the company owning everything. The arrangement of the government as a socialist communist arrangement on its hierarchy, on the basis of its implementation of its business, intermingling with the capitalist arrangement, allowing itself to tamper with the arrangement like J-secular civil war and the corruption around it, has been socially engineered by the insurrectionists using the government against the function of its oath, and thus disconnecting itself from the use of its office, acting independently under arbitrary means, which dictates the function of an action by an individual without a legal government, and that not legal government is the Confederacy, and their loyalty to the Confederacy, or which they just call the government, according to the Druid arrangements, create the alternate language specific to the wizards who understand the dog whistles and the participants of what that means actively go into the arrangements of covering for those crimes against the law, preventing the possibility of a remedy to a secret, which is the function of communism, and their arrangement of using their corruption against it for the communism centrally plans the economy in favor of undermining the various members of the public, such as the black community and other targeted communities, under Lindsey Graham's racist military position for declarations of war, and the violation of rights by the conspiracy against rights, by the violation of the Constitution, by the complete destruction of the law, is holistically separate to the issue of capitalism versus communism when you are only referring to communism as the source material. So if the source material says communism and you say this is why capitalism can't work, you've never mentioned capitalism once in that argument. Barbarism of consumption by the communists have actively engaged in the hierarchy of the two-tiered system of those at the top consuming at the expense of those at the bottom. Capitalists trade money, communists trade people. The function of the extortion creates a commune inside the United States, historically called plantations. The commune and the plantation are the same thing. It's just a micro government in that arrangement, and that micro government for exploitation is communism. That's not capitalism gone wrong. That's not anything to do with capitalism whatsoever. That's pure exploitation by communism, established by the government, conducting Satan worshippers and their various fraudulent exchanges as a mechanism for their wizard society, which is the foundation of all of their arrangements. Fraud is their base loyalty. The rejection of God and all of his definitions is their core identity. God liberates man from sin, and Satan liberates man from God, the moralities of God, the restrictions of law and order, which are essential to a godly functioning society, are revoked by the existence of those functions, and thus their unitary executive theories and other fraudulent claims of privilege, allowing them to restrict essential pieces of information to prevent the government from doing its job correctly in the systemic sedition, is the function of the infection, which has been fed into the United States for a catastrophic amount of time, which is actively been exploited as a weakness. Their corruption, which they are so fucking proud of, is weakness to its enemies, designed for its specific destruction, as their self delusion is exponentially catastrophically compounded on itself for their capacity to own people through their slave trade, such as their war on David, using the surveillance in order to actively tamper with the people that they're watching, disqualifying it from being watching. It is no longer a studying of the person, it is an active scripted theater which has nothing to do with base reality. These things are entirely 100% disconnected from capitalism. There is no functioning overlap to a free market, which has actively been tampered with. The agreement that it is a free market is the agreement that you can't commit the conspiracy against the rights in order to gain an exploitative advantage. By definition, it cannot exist. The tampering with the base qualities, as they're using fluoride to put into the water in order to engage in dumping of waste, in order to force the consumption of the general public of the poison, creates byproducts. And there are many poisons that they put into the water that they refuse to purify out, which are specifically designed to not be consumed. And the point of forcing the consumption by putting them in the tap water is to guarantee the injury to the general public, such as the attack on their capacity to reproduce, such as their microplastics, which they have actively infiltrated into the system, preventing the possibility of escaping from their arrangements, as the government itself is the one behind the crime. Its spell, by its double agents, are actively protecting itself. The crime against the general public, such as the sundown towns, are the foundational quality which are actively protected by misclassifications. And that misclassification generates the systemic weakness, as there has to be um, a power in order to engage in the use of guaranteeing that the law is followed. But they've centralized the power and then turned that power against the function of its office. And so that is the definition of a parasite engaged in insurrection against the host nation. And that arrangement has become catastrophically the proof of the need of the Second Amendment in order to decentralize power, in order to force the government to do its goddamn job and start being responsible, uncensor those informations, file them correctly, process them correctly, remove your druid-led uh, officers trained in your special wizard schools in order to teach them how to more effectively defraud the public, remove the insurgents altogether, and do your job correctly, which requires, by definition, the existence of the duel. David Bowles has to be sent to DC in person, recognized in public by Congress, as a preparation with the specific orders arranging him to go back to his original obstructed home or his mansion in D.C., which he would have originally had without the restraints. They have to order the release of all of this and then give it appropriate amount of time in order to process that information, as the release of such a large title would exist by definition too many changes in the general society to be done quickly, and thus the necessary delays in the courts and the expirations would necessarily have to take place first. But as long as the crime is happening, it's impossible. And as long as there isn't sober control of the faculties of all of the companies and all of the agents, such as when James Comey tried to rush Trump before he had full control over his faculties inside the White House. Um, these types of strategies are fraudulent and it needs to be corrected against, and the law dictates that they have to be sober. So, by definition, those functions have to return to the original controlled position in order for it to be viable, and thus those processes have to, by definition, be compensated back to those arrangements as it catches up on old debt and focuses on its legal team in order to have that sober control while it is developing its sobriety to be able to file the necessary court paperwork to American judges as opposed to Confederate judges and insurrectionists at every level of the government, which is seeking the compulsion into the communist fascist arrangement in insurrection and destruction of all things American, compelling them into a permanent nightmare hellscape that is what they are loyal. The existence of many of the intelligence agencies and their functions had at its contemptible existence um, actively been tolerated under the promise that there would be an intelligence function which they had already presumed would have been existing if it had been viable, which is the function of David as intelligence oversight, as the military branch specifically existing as the oversight to guarantee that they are restrained, um, was not actively enforced. Their position that there's going to be restrictions on them by the intelligence community and the protection of the whistleblowers was systematically undermined, disqualifying the original argument for its right to exist. And thus, those intelligence communities, such as the CIA, such as the FBI, such as the NSA, DHS, and the rest of them, they don't actually have a right to exist, and they should have been dismantled by virtue of their fraud. Once the general public saw them act without those restrictions which qualify the right to exist, they should have been dismantled. And the act of treason which has systemically gone through them has funneled all of their hatred and contempt, which has been undermining those functions, into the primary hierarchy for the aristocracy, which is David, which has generated all of the base qualities of why they're abusing David Bowles. And in that arrangement, they have admitted to a superiority by their violence. Their crimes are their confessions. And in those arrangements of their contempt for David, his oversight, his power, his superiority to them in all facets has qualified their foundational fear and contempt for him, barring all of his functions in connection with the government in any legitimate function, barring the function of the public arrangements in any sober way, and thus the disconnection by the traps and the illusions for the smoke and the mirrors has generated the inability for the government to function because the purpose of their abuses against David Bowles is sedition. They don't want the government to do its job. and the prevention of the government from doing its job, being for the purpose of insurrection, makes them an enemy of every man, woman, and child in the United States and all of its allies who have sworn loyalty to defend it in a mutual war, by definition, are liable to assist David in creating the duel and the military retaliation against the insurrectionists. And they, such as through Lindsey Graham, have actively threatened those other countries into subordination to the insurrectionist parasite, that they too may be subject to the Nazis created by the Confederacy, so that Hitler's youth may rule them permanently. The Church Committee, which had actively restrained or ordered the restraint of lots of the insurrectionist functions of the Confederate double agents, was actively undermined by the de facto policies of restricting David so that they could not engage in the enforcement against their criminal operations. And the inability to do so means, by definition, they are no longer subordinate to Congress, generating contempt for Congress, generating their lack of confessions to Congress, which has actively undermined the process through the sedition of David's connection with Congress under their official capacities. As they have discovered David's secret function, they have systemically put their blocks against that for the de facto sedition as the replacement government, as they infect the United States with Confederate policies replacing the Republic's policies, making it a different government in its entirety. It's not just a shadow government, it's a different country. And that is something that William Barr and other enemies of the United States have actively promoted and celebrated. Many of the infections from the Confederacy, saying that the false assertion that judicial activism is the creation of policy without the legislature, while defending American rights or the spirit of the law, which Scalia says that he doesn't believe in ghosts, but I digress. The assumption that those protections, often quoted, such as substantive due process, qualifies the position of something that they would like the legislature to do, but they are blocking the legislature from performing the action. Their sedition against David performs the sedition against the legislator is their contempt for Congress, which generates the inability for Congress to actually write a competent policy under the active war conditions, which are distracting them as they do not have the functional capacity under these conditions in order to manufacture those desirable outcomes. At which point, the validation, which is consistent with the Constitution, is the enemy of the Confederacy, which has actively been infecting and advancing itself against the Americans, which is through, by definition, the actual judicial activism, as they are wizards. All of their functional arguments are fraud, and thus the use of their fraud for their spells and their dog whistles generates the disposition towards the disillusionment of all forms of competent order, at which points clever men can use creative arguments to say the exact opposite as they had in the past, and thus, covering the same subject, have said both of its opposites in order to advance their strategic endgames. Attorney-client privilege, as the foundation of many of their secrets, uh, does not have the capacity to cover criminal actions. Similar, the president using attorney-client privilege as presidential privacy or executive privilege would not, by definition, have the same exception to the rule, as the president having the capacity to commit a crime does not have authority to do so, and thus must be able to be repented against having existed for the function of the crime in the preservation of the law, or you have a permanent infection corrupting it, as the protection of all previous presidents by future presidents generates the continuation of the insurrection, which is no longer managed by the general public. And the public not being able to form a government means there is no republic, means there is no constitutional republic, means the United States does not have tools by which to enforce its will. Which is nothing to say about unitary executive theory, which is the statement that there is no capability for the United States to protect itself from these functions, and that the Constitution itself is an enemy of the government, as the Constitution says only Congress can declare war, and unitary executive theory says the executive has no restrictions, checks, or balances, and all is subordinate to the king, and thus since all is subordinate to the king, there are only the functions of its officers who are subordinated to itself, which, having received the delusion of the king of Babylon, who was provided by his advisors to say that for an extended period of time only he can be worshipped, was by definition, sentencing his favorite advisor to death by virtue of Daniel being supportive of a different god and being unwilling to pray to another god, such as the king. And thus, you have these arrangements which are beyond the powers of even the king to remedy, as the king has already set out his phantom selves. The king is subordinate to the law in Babylon, and in the United States, the creation of plausible deniability has divided the powers of the executive throughout the agencies into a non subordinated hierarchy, which does not have any limitations on itself, which would qualify its legitimate capacity as a subordination of the superior function, as it has reproduced in itself the capacity of creating phantom cells which automate the process of all of the orders, and that automation is not to be touched or tampered with or investigated, at which point gross negligence is their primary strategy. And since gross negligence is the primary strategy, the confession is that all of its functions are criminal intent, and the function of criminal intent disqualifies it from being a function of the nation of law, qualifying them as enemies of the United States government and not the function of it. And in these arguments, you have systemically proven that the racist system infecting the United States through its dog whistles has gone unchecked and has corrupted itself exponentially and catastrophically as a parallel system to the Americans, creating an abuse theater function for a false narrative, a simulation, if you will, of reality, and that simulated reality by the wizard communists being fully disconnected from any American function can only be viewed with malicious contempt. The function of delaying the release of information for an extended period of time in order to defend the crime is, by definition, aiding and abetting, accelerating the function of how long it takes for the expiration clock to start. So if you have a 7 year function which is expired at the end of the 7 years and you delay its entry to the court being able to be used, then there is no viable mechanism for representation through the government for a remedy. At which point, that engagement of not having a remedy to a secret is the barring of the constitutional right to a remedy by the Constitution. And in that function, you have disconnected the United States from its government in its entirety and are exclusively functioning under the KKK for its various denominations and phantom cells which have infiltrated into the function, generating a lawless society of wizards and terrorists who are functionally exclusively loyal to fascism and to communism as enemies of these United States. And terrorists and those who support terrorists, according to George W. Bush, being an enemy of the United States means it was generically already understood that they are subversives. The strategies of these Satanist degenerates include, but are not limited to, the function of accepting liability beyond their capability of being able to pay, qualifying their diversification of the punishment and disillusionment in the various doublespeak frauds conducted for the express purpose of making sure that they commit too many crimes to be forced to pay anything, and in that fraud racket cannot be accepted by the American system, as the criminal intention is to be guilty of all of it. The intention is to have all of the liabilities, and thus they must pay the entirety of the liabilities, even if it is excessive of their ability to pay. If they go to the store and they take too many items for them to be able to pay, and they've already used them, they're going to be forced to pay by definition. So it's substantively no different in that arrangement that they be forced to pay the American liabilities according to the American policies, which they have been obstructed, and the obstructing of that function by the sedition against David blocks the American policies that would process their crimes, and thus the arrangement requires the full investigation of the American policies, which are being replaced by the Confederacy, so that they can be forced to pay the entirety of the bill under the American law. And these crimes include the poisoning of the general public by targeting for their efforts in order to craft their new magic society. And their magic society believes the original assumption of the Greek position, which is that those who are more godly or compelled to be godly, which under the Mormon Satanism is compulsory by the wizards, have to have a smaller dick, as the smaller dick signifies divinity and a larger dick signifies bestiality or being beast-like, not just the sex with animals things, which they do also, but irrelevant. These functions would be compelled by their forced injections into the general public of the poisons, which, as in specific alignment with the rape culture, means by definition they're ruining the sexual market value for women, which is a foundational position, as the destruction of the value means that they can only acquire the value in compliance with the rape permits, which requires them to subordinate themselves to the rapist, permanently preventing the possibility of a remedy to a secret, and thus women will always be considered crazy for their opposition to the function of being subordinated to the rape, and thus they are to be seen and not to be heard, and thus in their silence permanently be disposed to the tyranny of the white supremacist. And this Plato's conspiracy is rape culture, which states that women do not have the authority to vote.